Welcome to your next module. So what we're going to discuss in this week's module is something called structural geology. So we've gotten through all the rock types, the minerals. We know about plate tectonics in the interior of the earth. We are going to pull a little bit from your plate tectonic knowledge because, of course, when we talk about structural geology, what we're really referring to is the rocks at the surface, sometimes at depth, that get deformed due to the stresses. And the argument, of course, is that the stress intensity is highest where plates are interacting with each other. So we tend to see rocks break under stress. This is what we call brittle deformation. And we also see rocks bend. This is what we call more ductile or plastic deformation. And so there's some property differences between the rocks, whether they bend or break, and there's some other factors that control that. But for the main lecture here, the structural geology is looking at these structures and, of course, using them to interpret what happened here, right? This is still our main goal as a geologist, is to understand the past. The rocks are telling us a story, so we want to look at these structures to help us understand what's occurred here in the geologic past. So the main, of course, PowerPoint here is going to go through all of these things. I've broken it down, the video and the talk over of the PowerPoint, into these three different videos here. So the structural geology is just the overview of what are they, and you're going to get into this concept of what's called a strike and dip. It's a way in the field to measure the orientation of layers that are no longer flat. So if you remember, when we talk about rocks, a lot of the rocks that are at the surface of the earth are sedimentary rocks. And these rocks are deposited horizontally. Typically, that is true. So like if you go to the Grand Canyon, you see the layer cake, the stack of rocks. So when they get disturbed from that and they change their orientation, it's an indication that there's been some stress applied and there's some weird structure there. We can use what's called a strike and dip. It's a compass measurement that's going to tell us the orientation of those layers. So you're going to look at folds and faults. Those are the two main structures that we care about. So you'll learn about measuring the strike and dip idea, and then you'll learn how to identify different folds based on how they look and different faults based on how they look. And so that's the main part of the lecture this week. There is this additional little YouTube video that talks about strike and dip because it can be a weird concept. So it might be helpful if you're struggling with that. You can take a look. Of course, in the lab, we're also going to do structural geology, and you'll have the opportunity to see some other ways to kind of describe strike and dip, which may help. And then for the article, we're going to focus on what we call the brittle deformation, where we break the rocks, and this is what we call a fault. And so it's just going to go into a little more detail here, so you can look at that article before you take the article quiz. And then finally, for the homework, I'm going to give you some examples. And here is the kind of handout, if you will, the PDF that you'll look at. And what it is it's 6 different box diagrams that the first 6 are asking you to tell me what type of fault that you see here. You'll be introduced to these 3 fault names: normal, reverse, and strike slip. And so your job is to identify which fault you're seeing in these little box diagrams and the specific stress that's causing these faults. So there's 3 stresses to go with the 3 faults. And so that's what your task is for this homework. These first 6 are fault types, and the second are going to be fold types. And so what you can do, of course, is just fill this out. If you're have an issue with writing on top of PDF, certainly they're numbered, so you can just grab a Word doc and write number 1 and tell me fault type, stress type. Number 2, fault type, stress type, and then just kind of make a list, and then you can just submit that as the homework if you can't figure a way to write on this or all that kind of good stuff. So that's what you're going to do in the main lecture. And then, like I said, for the lab, we're going to cover similar topics. So useful, hopefully, to kind of reinforce what you're learning in lecture, but when you get to the lab here, it's going to look something like this, and it's going to talk about strike and dip. So you're going to get a second chance to kind of understand it. Here we'll talk about more in depth about the symbols that we use and things like that. So you'll get into that. And then, of course, you're going to talk about faults and folds. And, of course, that's what we've talked about in the lecture. So here's some folding diagrams, some faulting diagrams, and all that kind of good stuff. And of course, you'll get to look at some maps too for the lab. So that's what we're going to do for structural geology. So the main focus, folds and faults, and of course, understanding the strike and dip concept. And that should get you through this week's module. As always, if you have some questions or you're having a hard time understanding some weird geology concepts, please don't hesitate to contact me and I will certainly help you out.